Thank you, Governor Abbott, for those remarks and that generous welcome. With that, let's get started. Our first guest is Sean Strawbridge. Sean has over 25 years of experience in the global transportation, trade, and energy sectors in both public administration and the private sector. In his role as CEO of the Port of Corpus Christi, he has focused his attention on capital placement,
and welcome to the
organizational alignment, there's Chancellor Sharp, and culture and strategic execution. Currently, the Port of Corpus Christi is the third largest port in the nation in revenue tonnage and the second largest port in Texas behind the Port of Houston. If you'd like to submit a question for Mr. Strawbridge, please utilize the chat button at the bottom of your screen. We will go till about 2:30 and wrap up with a few audience questions. Welcome, Sean. It's great to see you.
It's great to be here, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us today. The topic on everyone's mind, how has COVID-19 impacted or affected port operations?
Well, the Port of Corpus Christi, as all Texas ports, we're deemed critical infrastructure by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And therefore, we have maintained full operational status throughout the pandemic. Volumes have obviously been impacted by COVID-19 and the economic destruction that we saw as a result of that. But our first quarter tonnage this year broke all previous records. So we were on a very strong pace prior to the pandemic. And Texas oil and gas certainly had reached new highs. We experienced a decline in April and May, but I think we may have seen the bottom in that period of time. We saw acute demand destruction, and now we are in a recovery. The big question is, of course, are we in a V-shaped recovery? Are we in a U-shaped recovery? Or are we in some sort of modified W-shaped recovery?
And you mentioned the oil and gas. The port moves approximately 1.4 million barrels per day of crude, or at least that was your peak in March of 2020 of nearly 1.7 million barrels per day. In terms of size or number of shipments, where does the Port of Corpus Christi rank among the world's ports for crude oil and petroleum products?
Well, we certainly rank in the top echelon for the United States. From a tonnage standpoint, revenue tonnage, we're in the top three. From an energy export perspective, we are the largest energy export port in the United States with our myriad of crude oil, finished product, as we call the refined products, with the million barrels a day of refining capacity that we have in Corpus Christi. Certainly the state's largest LNG liquefaction facility owned by Cheniere, Corpus Christi Liquefaction. So we're certainly a dominant player in the energy space, and we work very closely with global trading partners and their gateways, most notably for Europe. Most of the business that we send to Europe, the energy that we send to Europe, moves through the Port of Rotterdam. Port of Rotterdam is a 400-year-old port authority. We work very closely with them on things like security, environmental protections, certainly productivity issues. They're a much larger port, but working in collaboration with other ports around the country and around the world is certainly something that we do. And as we emerge as a leader, we're seeing ports from other parts of the world come and benchmark off of what we're doing as well.
Outside of ports, I've worked with you for a number of years. Can you talk about your outreach to the Permian Basin and other oil fields to market the port and gain allies that don't regularly think about the port or coastal infrastructure in their day-to-day?
The Port of Corpus Christi has certainly positioned itself as a premier gateway for crude oil from the Permian Basin. Our midstream customers, which have made the investments in pipelines and in storage facilities and in terminals, they play a pivotal role in ensuring the direct connectivity to the coast from the Permian Basin. Recent pipeline expansions have increased throughput for coastal gateways, and certainly us at the Port of Corpus Christi. And many analysts predict that we at the Port of Corpus Christi will remain the leading crude export port for the United States for the foreseeable future. We couldn't do that if we didn't have a healthy industry, and that starts with the E&P space, certainly the producers, large and small, and we want to make sure that they understand they've got a partner at the coast that they can lean on, and they can rest assured we're making the necessary infrastructure investments to make sure that their molecules can find an outlet and can move in a competitive and safe manner.
That's fantastic. And really, it's been in the last 5 years, right? The oil export ban was lifted in December of 2015. And the Panama Canal was expanded that same year, a little earlier in the year. So how has that changed the port?
Yeah, Jason, those are some interesting paradigms. The Panama Canal expanded, and the 40-year-old ban on the exporting of U.S. produced crude oil was lifted both in 2015. The result of that has really been epic growth for the energy space in exports, not only for crude, but certainly, as we've seen, for LNG and other types of natural gas liquids. You know, the change in paradigm in our industry, though, is the vessel technology has emerged over the last 30 years. It has evolved so much faster than infrastructure can keep pace. Vessels have gotten much larger. They can carry much more product on one ship with limited crew. And really, you've got to make sure that you have infrastructure that can keep pace with that. That means deeper channels. That means longer berth. That means taller cranes and taller docks to be able to handle these larger classification of ships. And that's really what the Port of Corpus Christi is focused on, is ensuring we've got not only the infrastructure needed to handle today's demand, but certainly the infrastructure for tomorrow's demand as well.
And so talk about managing that growth. How do you, is it with partners that are coming into the port, or how do you adjust to grow and expand and scale up?
You know, like any business, in the Port of Corpus Christi, even though we are an independent political subdivision of the state of Texas and we are a government agency, we have taken the position that we're going to run the organization as a business. And no business survives without customers. And customers will not continue to do repeat business with you if you don't create value for them. So while we've seen tremendous growth since the export ban was lifted in 2015, and we're certainly in the process of widening and deepening the Corpus Christi ship channel to accommodate those larger vessels, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we understand what's important to our customers, and we're creating additional value for them. We want their goods and services to be competitive. We're Texans, and we're going to compete not only with other states, but certainly with other nations. And that only happens if we're working together and we're understanding what each other's needs are. So from our standpoint, working closely, not only with our customers, but certainly with state and federal legislators to ensure that we've got sufficient policy to support the customers and the economic prosperity that really drives our economy. That's the role that the Port of Corpus Christi has certainly played. And thus far, it seems to be paying off for us.
That's fantastic. With the shale revolution in the United States and the energy renaissance that we've seen in this country, it's really seen benefits across the manufacturing and Gulf Coast. And I wondered if you could quantify how big of an impact, an economic impact, does the port have for Corpus Christi and the surrounding area?
It's a great question, Jason, and some of these numbers are going to be mind-boggling. They certainly are for me, and I am familiar with them. The Port of Corpus Christi alone is responsible for over $150 billion per year in economic output for the United States. In addition, $19 billion of that is for the state of Texas alone. We generate nearly $450 million in local and state taxes, and we support nearly 100,000 direct jobs and over 1.2 million induced jobs. In other words, we are an economic development agency. Nearly $200 million a day of goods value moves through the Port of Corpus Christi, and we're seeing about $55 billion with a B of private industrial investment going on in the South Texas coastal bend. And the reason for that is the Port of Corpus Christi and its deep draft infrastructure. We've still got large swaths of available land for development. We're the most populated coastal city in the state of Texas at about 500,000 metropolitan. So we've got a fairly robust, both professional and trade workforce. We've got a cheap, abundant supply of energy. And lastly, the 2-county airshed that we operate in is still in air attainment. That means we are below the federal threshold that takes you into non-attainment, which then requires additional regulations, additional protocols, additional equipment. And we estimate that that saves our customers probably close to $2 billion a year by maintaining that air quality that we have. And that's working in partnership with our customers. So clearly there's a big economic impact to the region, to the state, and to the nation. And that's a responsibility that we take very seriously.
That's fantastic. President Trump, when he was in Midland last week, announced the extension of LNG authorizations through 2050. How does that affect certainty and potential investment in the port?
Yeah, certainty is absolutely critical to any business. And the Port of Corpus Christi is home to one of the largest liquefaction facilities in the world, as I mentioned, Cheniere Energy's Corpus Christi liquefaction facility in San Patricio County. The company had already planned for additional trains to increase capacity for LNG exports. And so knowing that LNG exports are going to be here for the duration is certainly that certainty that not only our customers want and the investors want, but their customers want as well. So our allies and our trading partners around the world want to know with 100% certainty that they're going to get American gas when they need it to create power for their utilities, to heat their homes, to cook their food. Now, that's a great position for the American oil and gas industry. And we're just happy to ensure that that infrastructure that's needed to get that gas to the demand centers is going to be in place and is certainly in place today and is continuing to evolve as we have developed those new markets for American oil and gas companies.
Oh, that's great to see. We saw news a couple of weeks ago that they were standing up a third train, Cheniere, and so that's wonderful. And then also saw earlier this week that Buckeye Energy Partners is also doing some crude oil export out of the port, and so that's phenomenal. Congress always seems to be working on new infrastructure packages, and we always get excited to see what potentially may be in there. But ports, I would think, would be at the top of the list. So how does some of these infrastructure conversations in Congress affect the ports, and what's needed there to compete globally?
Well, Jason, as I'm sure your listeners know, Congress is currently really struggling to get anything done. It's a toxic environment in DC right now during this election season. The pandemic has certainly made things more difficult. However, we do believe that there will still be some things that, some bipartisan packages, the Water Resources Development Act, most notably, which passed the House in a voice vote a couple weeks ago, and we're hopeful that the Senate will pass a reconciled version of that. And that really is the piece of legislation that funds water infrastructure in this country, including navigable waterways, both coastal and inland. But as negotiations with Congress continue during the next supplemental and relief legislation, ports across the country are certainly asking that they be considered for some funding to ensure that they have the necessary resources and infrastructure in place. No funding has been provided to assist seaports, and the maritime transportation system, despite emergency relief funding being provided to other modalities of transportation, most notably airports, has not seen that same support. A lot of that is really just from a lack of understanding of the importance of seaports in this country by Main Street America. Ports are vital for each state. They're vital for our nation, and they're certainly vital to the global economy. U.S. coastal ports create total economic value in terms of revenue to businesses, personal income, and economic output of $5.4 trillion per year. That's roughly 26% of the GDP. Construction and maintenance funding for navigation projects, such as the Corpus Christi Ship Channel's deepening and widening project, is certainly critical for having a modernized channel that will, again, support the goods movement and the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing and U.S. energy to our allies and trading partners around the world. That's the discussion that we're having with members of Congress. It's difficult, and we understand, given all the vagaries of what's going on in D.C., and certainly an election season doesn't help, but we continue to remain hopeful and optimistic.
And just from my education, the mechanics of that deepening and widening, is that dredging? When we're typically talking about dredging the port, the deepening and widening?
Yeah, that's correct, Jason. So, you think about a main channel, a ship channel, that's the main arterial, the main the main artery, the main freeway, if you will, if we're going to use a surface transportation analogy for any port. And when the vessels come in, because those vessel technologies are getting bigger, that's why the Panama Canal expanded. They didn't expand to then have them build bigger vessels. The bigger vessels were already built, and the Panama Canal recognized that if they didn't create additional infrastructure to handle those larger ships, then they would be relegated to a niche player in global trade lanes. That's really the arms race for infrastructure between countries, is making sure they've got sufficient infrastructure in place. That's the conversation that we're having with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and in both the House and the Senate. And the one thing that I think I'm encouraged by is, there are 80 congressional members who are part of the House Ports Caucus, which is co-chaired by a great Texan on the Republican side, Randy Weber, who has 5 ports in his congressional district, and Alan Lowenthal from Long Beach, California, who has a large port in his district. He's representing the Democrat side. So when it comes to ports, ports do have a bipartisan appeal from the jobs that are associated with them, certainly the economic prosperity associated with them, but also the foreign policy in making sure that we can craft trading foreign policy around the relationships that we have, not only with our allies, but some of the trading partners. And when you're seeing that front and center right now with China and the Trump administration holding or attempting to hold China to task, the Trump administration, the saying is they're either going to bring China to the table or they're going to bring China to their knees. That's what ports do. Ports are part of that whole perspective. And that's really why foreign policy on both sides of the aisle can certainly be crafted by policy related to seaports.
Well, it's been phenomenal. I was on a call with the Department of Energy last week, and they were talking about 38 countries on 5 continents receive Texas LNG and American liquefied natural gas, and what a difference that's made, particularly for Poland, for South Korea, for some of our allies that have traditionally relied on Russia for their energy needs, and that really starts right here in Texas at the Port of Corpus Christi.
It certainly does, and that's why you're seeing more foreign direct investment. And I'll just share a brief little arc of a narrative of a company, an Austrian company that came to Texas. It had 13 sites in 8 locations, including the United States, where it wanted to build an expansion project. They had never built outside of Europe, the European theater, and this Austrian company was 100% dependent on Russian gas. They decided to invest in Corpus Christi, and now they have the greenest facility for making hot briquette iron, which is what they manufacture in the steel making process, a company called Voestalpine. They're bringing in Brazilian iron ore using Texas gas, reducing the carbon footprint by half of what it normally is to produce this hot briquette iron. And then they're re-exporting it to Mexico and to Europe to be used in the automobile manufacturing industry. That's a great story of how, we really can exist in taking full advantage of the ingredients that we have here in Texas, not only the energy, but the people and the commitment to ensuring that we're going to be a business-friendly environment. And I think as a result of this COVID pandemic, we are going to see more reshoring. We're going to see more manufacturing being brought home with the passage of the USMCA and the implementation of that just a few short weeks ago. We think we're going to see more manufacturing, not only coming to the US, but coming to northern Mexico and certainly Canada as well. So, I think the future is bright, but we've just got to get through this pandemic and make sure that we're going to be better for the other side.
Absolutely. If you'd like to submit a question for Mr. Strawbridge, please utilize the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And I've got a few more here. So how can the broader oil and gas community support our ports and Texas coastal infrastructure?
It's a great question. You know, one of the things that is a challenge for us is our coastal and inland navigation waterways are overseen by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. That's a 200-plus-year-old federal agency. It's a Department of Defense agency. And Congress has authorized over $95 billion of infrastructure projects for them, both on navigation and on flood control and flood risk mitigation. That's how much they've authorized. Now, this last year, they appropriated $3 billion. So they've got a tremendous backlog from what Congress has mandated that they do, and then what resources they've been given. So if the oil and gas industry wants to help, or if any constituent really wants to help, it's to ensure that your representatives understand that the Corps of Engineers needs more resources, and that may even include delegating some of that authority to the states and to the local sponsors like the Port of Corpus Christi to be able to execute on some of that work. In the absence of some of these other tools, the Corps just takes way too long. They're not able to bring the certainty to the market that we need, and these projects become much more expensive than they probably could or should. So if there's one single area that industry can certainly help with, it's an advocacy for better processes with the Corps, more streamlined processes, and perhaps some of that delegation of authority to the states. Let the states take control of some of their destiny. And I certainly think that if Texas was delegated that authority, we could execute on those projects better, faster, and cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely. That's phenomenal, and we would certainly like to help you in that endeavor. The Alliance led a coalition last session to secure some delegation authority from the EPA and actually move a permit from the Railroad Commission to the TCEQ, but in the process we eliminated a duplicative process at the EPA, and Commissioner Lindley and the TCEQ are doing a phenomenal job to being able to stand up that permit process for oil and gas producers, and it's going to save them time and it's going to save them money. So we certainly want to be helpful for you on that. What about the Texas legislature? Hey, are there things happening at the Texas legislature that we need to be aware of, and how we can be supportive of ports there?
Certainly, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. As we work on our legislative agenda for this next session, we're going in with a very sober view of what is going to happen in the next legislation. Look, let's face it, there are really going to be three things that the legislature is going to be focused on. On the House side, it's going to be selecting a new speaker and then the subsequent committee chairs. It's also going to be redistricting is going to be a big focus of this next legislative session. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, the budgetary constraints that will be presented to the state as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Anything beyond that may be difficult. I will tell you from our perspective, the Port of Corpus Christi has crafted a legislative agenda that we are asking the state legislature to give us more tools in our tool belt to be able to help this economy recover and help put the great women and men from South Texas back to work. Some of the things that we are looking at is allowing us to engage in more public-private partnerships, more commercial and perhaps light industrial. Right now, our mandate is heavy industrial related to navigation commerce, but we do have some properties that may be better suited in the tourism space. We don't have the ability today. We are legislatively prohibited from developing with a private developer perhaps hotels or retail space. Other ports around the country do that. The Port Authority in New York, New Jersey, the Port of Los Angeles, the Port of San Francisco, the Port of Seattle. They all are engaged in multiple types of economic development, whether it's real estate development, whether it's maritime, whether it's airports. We're just looking for some additional economic development tools that we can use to really continue to help, particularly the travel and the tourism sector, which has been hardest hit here in Texas and certainly in South Texas.
Well, and y'all have some phenomenal adjacent landmarks in the USS Lexington and the Texas State Aquarium. I've camped in those with the Cub Scouts a number of times, and it's always great to visit Corpus Christi and the coast. So we certainly want to be helpful in that process for y'all. Sean, this was phenomenal. So thank you so much for the time today. I know you're in Houston juggling other conferences, and we really appreciate your insight, particularly on this next legislative session. I wondered if you had any closing thoughts for our members.
You know, first of all, I just want to thank the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers. I want to let the energy sector know that, you know, we're in this together. We're going to continue to work together, whether it's legislatively, whether it's through more public-private partnerships. The port is very, very well positioned to assist in this trying time. We were ranked by Moody's as having the second best liquidity of any public port authority in the entire nation. That's a badge of honor for us because that really shows that we've been saving our nickels and dimes and we've been taking our fiduciary extremely seriously. But really, it's about getting the great women and men back to work, particularly those who have lost their jobs, the small businesses that have lost their jobs and lost their way. And we're going to continue to do our part to make sure that, again, we come back better than ever. So I want to thank all of your listeners for their support. And we're just looking forward to coming out of this as best we can. Thank you, Jason.
That's perfect. Sean, thank you so much. And thanks for your team for pulling this together. If anyone is interested, the port can be found on the web at portofcc.com. And they really have a phenomenal website there that tracks imports and exports. And so I highly encourage you to take a look at it. It's portofcc.com.